Good morning. Thank you for having us here. We're going to cue up the presentation. And let me just make a few opening remarks and tell you about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Bob Popinski, that Megan talked about it toward the end. Bob and I worked at Moak Casey together for almost 6 years. And some of you know Bob. Some of you may not know Bob in terms of his involvement in school finance. But how many years at Moak Casey? 15 years? 16. 16? Yeah. Is that regular years or dog years, Bob? It's regular years. And Bob was integrally involved in a number of the school finance issues. Worked at the feet of Joe Wisnowski for many years. And along with Joe, of course, Omar that's here, and some others of you that I have watched and provided information regarding the school finance landscape and scenario in Texas for many years. And we've seen a significant shift going in because of House Bill 3. The question is it a seismic shift? Is it really that big of a shift? And there's 4 things that we want to cover in our presentation today. And as I talk a little bit about some of the things that have happened in the overarching, overviewing aspects of school finance. Bob will get into some more of the details. And of course, Mike Moses will talk a little bit about what we can see now as it relates to what we're looking forward to in some of the aspects of public education. So I think you'll find it beneficial and interesting. We've tried not to overlap too much with some of the other presentations that are going to be here today, and but also give you a good overview of what happened in this past legislative session. You know, I guess the legislative session probably really began in the interim, and it began in the interim with the School Finance Commission. And the School Finance Commission was something that was significant in terms of the conversation about what could take place to have a meaningful improvement in school finance in Texas. You know how that whole commission started off. For the first few meetings, everybody argued over what actually the numbers were. How much was the state share? How you counted the state share. That had started toward the end of the 85th legislative session, and there was a lot of people that were looking at different ways other than how the LBB had calculated state share and calculated expenditures. So that was a conversation that was ongoing about what really was the state share, and had the public school community really been representing what the state share was about. Once that became resolved, they began to look at a bunch of nuances and different programs and programmatic changes, innovation ideas. And one of those that rose to the top quickly was the use of current year values. And current year values is something we're going to go into more today, and some of your other speakers will talk about some of the issues about current year values. But really, the conversation about current year values didn't begin with the School Finance Commission. It began with the post-Hurricane Harvey conversations that they had in the legislature. That was because we make an assumption that so many of our representatives and so many of our decision makers and elected officials have the understanding of certain aspects of school finance that you do on an everyday basis. They were very surprised and could not understand, particularly newer and influential members of these committees, that prior year values were used. And that began to evolve in this conversation that, if we have another hurricane experience, if we have another natural disaster experience, the current values would be something that would be much more beneficial to use. And then it really began to progress with Chairman Betancourt about, well, if we went to current year values instead of prior year values, that becomes another short-term revenue mechanism, a way to gain money to possibly finance some of the school reforms. So how much was actually invested in public education and property tax relief? We'll talk about that. And I guess maybe one of the biggest questions that we'll have that Bob will talk about and Mike will reference also, is this sustainable? Because there's one thing that was lacking in this whole conversation, and that was, well, it wasn't lacking because there was some conversation about a sales tax swap or a referendum about having an election in November about the dedication of the sales tax, but that didn't happen. So there's no new real revenue mechanisms outside of these things that went away, and they're not sustaining ongoing revenue mechanisms. They're repurposing money. What went away? Cost of education index went away. High school allotment went away. The shift to current year values. These all generated money that were going to help them do some of these things about the $6.5 billion that they were going to put in public schools as opposed to the other $5 billion or so they put into property tax relief. So the question is it sustainable? And then, of course, what comes next? And Mike will talk some about that with his insight and vision and experiences he had. Next slide, Bob. The politics of this whole situation. These three gentlemen right here, you know, they hadn't signed the bill yet. They hadn't signed House Bill 3, have they, Omar? Governor sitting on his desk. Deadline is when? Father's Day, June 16th. So they've got a week for veto and to sign the bill, and they will. There may be some more changes. There may be some more things they're working out. Because it happened in conference committee, there were a lot of holes left in this thing about particulars, about how things were going to work out. And that letter we were going to get from TEA a couple of weeks ago hadn't come out yet. And do you know how many times it's mentioned in House Bill 3 to be determined by the commissioner? Anybody counted those yet? Just pull up on your Word document and do a search for that phrase. It's a lot. In fact, TEA has said how many more personnel units they're going to need? 55 plus, just to be able to implement this. Jim, that's a lot of new people because they got a lot of work to do and a lot of say-so. Why is everybody looking at me? Why is everybody looking at Dan Patrick in that picture? Because he's so handsome? That could be. Or are they looking at him because they're at him because he just said $5,000 teacher raise for everyone in the state? Maybe that's why they're looking at him. Because that was, and I don't use this phrase a lot, brilliance in the same sentence as Dan Patrick, but that was brilliant about the opening gambit about a $5,000 teacher pay raise. That became the most significant issue that he carried, had a lot of traction, polled well, guided this whole process as it went forward before it culminated in HB 3, which wasn't a $5,000 teacher pay raise. Bob will talk a little bit of that, and David Thompson has been involved along with Omar and some others about what this actually means about spending 35% or 30% and 75%, who gets it, who doesn't, and what kind of impacts they're going to have on your local districts. They could be looking at Dan Patrick because you know what the number one rumor in Austin is, don't you? If you like to deal in rumors, which I don't. Okay, I don't do that. Is that he's headed to Washington this summer. Don't know, but that's a significant rumor that's out there. The other portion is when you look at this, you look at those three gentlemen right there. Dan Patrick, Governor Abbott, Speaker Bonin, first-time Speaker Bonin. Will all three of these be back for the 87th session, Gordon? Well, will the Lieutenant Governor go to Washington? And will the governor, is he going to run again? Or is he kind of ready to do something else? And Speaker Bonin is in the House of Representatives that now has 65 Democrats, and he's a Republican. And after the next voting cycle, as David Mike could talk about a little bit, all of a sudden that's significantly changing because you pick up 11 more Democrats in the House of Representatives in Texas, and for the first time since Noah was a fisherman, you're going to have a Democratic-controlled House of Representatives, and you could very well have a new Speaker of the House. So, let's look a little bit about the state budget, because now that we've moved to a budget and to a funding system that's highly, highly dependent on state revenues, let's look at the total state budget. $250 billion in the next state budget. It's a 15% increase without the supplemental funding. And the supplemental funding, it was a significant amount, was $9.9 billion this year. That pays for Medicare. You know, they never fully fund Medicare. So, and other issues that came up, you know, you had natural disaster issues with Harvey. So $9.9 billion were in the supplemental budget. So you got a $250 billion budget, and the next state budget, even with the increase and even with including supplemental funding of the $9.9 billion, you still have a 10.7 increase in state budget. So it was the benefit, all benefited from a vibrant, booming Texas economy, and also an economy that has run more than just this biennium, but other years. $6.1 billion were used from the rainy day fund. TRS was a major recipient. Hurricane Harvey, other issues. You know, the Economic Stabilization Fund of the Rainy Day Fund was moving up, going to be up toward $15 billion, and it had to be spent down a little bit. $6 billion is a pretty good spend down. One-time expenditures, you manage your budgets, you know what you do. Sometimes when you go into fund balance, you don't put one-time expenditures toward what? Ongoing cost. So there's some ongoing cost in here, which again has some of the things we have to resolve about sustainability. Here are some of the average annual growth. Because we're dependent on taxes, sales tax is the most significant, the highest revenue mechanism we have in the state. And there's only been 2 times in the past few years that we've had a decline in sales tax. Anybody want to think what they are? What years they possibly could be? Well, just in case you want to know, I will tell you. They were in 2001 and 2003 when we had a recession. And then, of course, the Great Recession from 2008 to 2010. And at that time, even with those bad economic times, sales tax never declined more than 4.7%. Give you another little item here about how important sales tax is. In 1972, when I was a sophomore in high school, sales tax generated $824 million in the state of Texas. In 2018, when I finally graduated from high school, sales tax generated almost $32 billion in Texas. So that economic driver right there of sales tax, always keep in mind, always keep up with, and know that's a significant driver. All at 16.4%, and you say, well, of course that's doing it, but the ups and downs in the oil industry are significant since 1972. Natural gas, 8.9%, personal income, 5%, and inflation times population growth in this whole period of time over the previous year has been 3.4%. So you see what some of the economic drivers are and the importance of those in what the future funding of Texas public schools are. I want to talk about this, and then we're going to move on to some more stuff with Bob, a little more of down in the weeds on some of the school finance aspects. But I call this compression and suppression. Okay, I was an English teacher, so I like things that have, not necessarily alliteration that rhyme. We have compressed taxes again. It's the first time since 2006. But we've also compressed revenue growth at the 2.5% cap. Our ability to raise local revenues have been suppressed. Tax rates have been compressed. So what does that mean for us? Now, as in 2006, remember the last time we compressed taxes, people that were at the $1.50, the highest tax rates, were rewarded more. People that were making more of a local effort. It's the same way now. When you look at the LBB runs and the other runs, if you were to $1.17, you're going to have more money than those that are $1.04. You look at some of the differences between per student allocation in Dallas County alone or in Region 10 alone, and you go, well, why is this district getting so much more of that? 2 things. If you were a suburban district and had a high CEI and you weren't Gilbert at $1.17, then you're going to see less money than some of your neighbors did. What were some of the other things that we had to work out from the last compression? Remember acetar? It was a 2-year fix that lasted 11 years. So there are going to be some things that are going to have to be worked out with House Bill 3. Some may be short-term, some may be long-term. Fractional funding. We just fixed that in the 85th legislature. For those of you that were at a different tax rate and got caught in that little zone on fractional funding back when we did the last level of compression. And how will non-uniform compression work in the second year, where everybody's not compressed at the same level? That's going to be a significant issue to talk about. The TRE landscape, what does that look after a year? Rick's going to talk about that. I told him he had the toughest topic since tax swaps may be may not be, well, they're not, are they, Bob? Not allowable. And Omar can tell you that there's probably a way around for those of you that have had tax swaps and what you're going to do there. November elections for TREs. Again, that suppression part of your ability of the local districts to make decisions to be able to raise local revenue. The reliance on state funding to work with new revenue sources, the impact of the 2.5% cap on future budgets, and the last one, the impact of July 1 fiscal years, June 30 fiscal year, July 1 new year. Is that a good idea anymore? Brent, I don't know. It was a good idea, helped a lot of fund balances. I don't know if it's going to be practical. I don't know if that's something we're going to need to continue to do. It's something you need to have a conversation going forward because the interplay of current year values, the interplay. In Harris County, anybody worked in Harris County before? When do they get values usually, David Thompson?
Usually final certified values end of August or even into September.
You're used to getting them July 25th. In Harris County, they don't usually get them the 1st of September. Settle up's going to be a huge issue. Some of you are going to talk about that moving forward. Quickly, this is how many bills that were introduced. There were 7,300 bills filed, 1,500 passed. That's a lot of bills. A lot of bills. Next slide, I think we're ready for Bob. You ready to come up and talk about these? Some of the issues that are really nice sequence here of things that are here, things that have disappeared, things that have changed going forward.
In the end, the members of the legislature didn't really care about the mechanics that much. They cared about the big picture. So I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about what the big picture looks like going forward, and then we can kind of get into some of the weeds. How many of you listened to the TASBO webinar last week? Amanda Brownson did a great job, and she's going to help you guys kind of get through this process. But how do you explain this to your community? How do you explain this to your board? It's kind of what I would kind of like to focus on today. So their big issue was recapture, property tax relief, and kind of overall funding for public education because the November elections did matter. So their recapture dilemma, they were going to set to have to pay $4.5 billion going back to the state in recapture if they didn't do anything. So they needed to curb that, needed to curb it fast. So how do you do that? Well, you raise the basic allotment. You can kind of do some other fixes to recapture along the way. And that's what House Bill 3 did. You can see the green line. It kind of leveled off recapture for a while. That's about $2.5 billion a year instead of shooting it up for $4.5 billion a year. That's a win for most legislative members going forward. It's a win to districts. A lot of school districts are getting out of recapture. A lot of the bigger districts are paying less recapture. And so moving forward, how do they maintain that until it creeps back up? And so how do you do that? You have to increase the basic allotment year after year. The big picture on how much went into public education funding this school year. Public education, to me, includes TRS and includes the Hurricane Harvey impact. And so it was a big number, even when you exclude the $5 billion in property tax relief. In all, $6.5 billion went into the foundation school program. Another $219 million went into special education funding. They had some settle-up issues that they needed to deal with. $435 million went into TRS state share contributions going forward. That's set to increase year after year. That doesn't include the district contribution or the active member contribution that we'll talk about in a little bit. The 13th check for retired teachers, up to $2,000 per retired teacher, cost the state $524 million. And as Curtis mentioned, they spent $1.4 billion on settling up all of the hurricane school-related issues. Now, the big number is $5 billion for property tax relief. That drives about 7 cents of property tax relief. It's going to reduce your compressed rate from $1 to 93 cents. It also picks up a little bit of the 2.5% compression that starts the second year. It's a big number. That $5 billion number is going to grow. So over time, what turns out to be not quite 40% of the pie is going to grow, and property tax relief is going to take a bigger and bigger portion of that pie. Overall, it was a good session for public education. We should be proud of that. They focused on it. It's not everything we wanted. It's not exactly how we wanted it to be funded. There's a lot of complications. They are going to mess up your financing for a couple of years now until you get used to current year values, until you figure out how to use comp ed funding and a myriad of other things that are going to pop up along the way. I don't have any answers for you on how a lot of this is going to work. It's just going to take time for the Texas Education Agency, the comptroller, to sort a lot of this out. But feel free to kind of talk with each other as we move along to figure this out. Now, the state share is going to increase. It was on a trajectory to go down to 32% if they did nothing. It was at 38%. Now, you can do state share increases two ways, right? You can invest more in the foundation school program, or you can cut property tax relief. Property taxes, and they did both this session. And we kind of, as schools, got into a little bit of trouble pressing so much on the state share, right? We would like to see more investment in public education, period. Not that tax relief isn't great, but we need to see property tax funding into public education so you can give teacher pay raises, so you can fund programs that work, and so they can keep up with inflation. Over time, the state share, if they continue to do this automatic property tax relief, is going to level off at about this 45%. And now they can come back and say, look, the state share is up. But guess what? The glass isn't going to grow that much moving forward. And that's the problem we're going to face moving on legislative session after legislative session. On average, school districts receive about $650 per ADA out of this new bill. Now there's some extremes, right? There's some that don't get any because some of the hold harmless provisions in there. You can't have more than 128% of the 2019-20 school year under old law. So some school districts got nothing, right? Some school districts, the very extremes, got $11,000 in per pupil spending. But on average, it's about $650. What is $650? It's a lot of money for school districts, but in the end, it barely keeps up with inflation. It barely refills kind of what they cut in 2011. And that's a problem going forward because they cut off, as Curtis mentioned, a lot of the revenue sources for public education moving forward. Where does this put this on the national rankings? My boss in San Antonio, Charles Butt, cares about this a lot, right? What does $650 do? We are 43rd in spending under the 2018 quality counts national rankings. The 2019 national count rankings came up. We're about $200 higher than that, so we spend on average, after kind of geographic adjustments, about $8,600 per kid. That's $650 that we got in per student spending. If Nevada doesn't do anything, if Nevada does not do a thing, might sneak us past Nevada. So this huge investment, this kind of historic investment, moved us up one spot to number 42, right? So how do we continue the march upward? How do we continue the march on the national rankings on a per student basis? So is it sustainable, right? Moody's investors came out with a comment soon after the bill was passed, basically saying, all right, we're depending a lot on the state to kind of keep things moving now. So school districts, watch out, because if there's an economic downturn, you're in trouble, just like you were in 2011. Why? Because they did three things to school districts, right? Starting in the second year of the biennium, you're going to have to do this 2.5% cap that automatically buys down school district tax rates, and it's going to cost the state upwards of $1 billion per year. Not each year, an additional $1 billion per year. So potentially by year 5, it's going to cost the state upwards of $5 billion. And that's a hit to the state, and that's a hit to the school district. They removed, obviously, the one-year bump you got from prior year values, and they delinked the Austin ISD from the golden pennies. That would have driven $2.2 billion to school districts this year. They removed that. They put it a percentage as a basic allotment, or 96th percentile. The 96th percentile is nowhere close to what the Austin yield would drive. So you just lost three things right here that are driving automatic funding to school districts. They're fine doing automatic adjustments for property tax relief. They are not fine for automatic inflationary adjustments for school districts, and that's a problem going forward. So getting into the weeds on House Bill 3, and I passed out kind of our side-by-side of what the House did, what the Senate did, and kind of what the final verdict was on a lot of this. This is up on our website if you need it for a PDF. And so this is getting into the weeds, and I know David's going to talk about the teacher compensation issue a lot, and Omar is going to go over the template. So I just thought I'd talk about some high-level issues as we move forward, right? The balancing act of the session is, how do we get the basic allotment high enough so that it reduces recapture, flows some money to school districts, especially when they're doing these things over on this side of the tightrope, right? They cut the cost of education index, which flowed upwards of $5 billion per year to school districts. They moved to current year values, which was $1.8 billion per year. They removed some Chapter 41 hold harmless, the high school allotment, which drove $400 million per year, and the gifted and talented. All of this is a balancing act to get to the basic allotment of $6,160. That's how they ended up with that, is they cut all of those programs and they were able to pump all of that money into the basic allotment, but not everyone wins under that scenario, as you saw on the timeline, where some districts didn't receive any benefit. So the teacher compensation issue, right? You're supposed to take 30% of your revenue gain, and what that means is what you had under old law, under last school year, and what you're getting under the new House Bill 3 under new law. And you're going to use 30% of that towards teacher compensation. It doesn't mean just salary. It can mean insurance premium cost. It can mean all of the definitional things that David's going to be talking about under compensation. 75% of that is going to have to go towards full-time teachers, counselors, nurses, librarians, and prioritizing differentiated compensation for teachers that have 6 or more years of experience, right? Do they give you guidelines for that? No. Will they eventually give you guidelines for that? I hope so, because I know TASB put out some notes the other day, and that's a good rule of thumb. But this is what's going to show up in the papers over the summer, is what school districts do for compensation. Remember, 30% of nothing, you can't give much of a teacher pay raise. While other districts got a pretty good bump and they could give a $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 pay raise, that's not going to look well if you're neighbors, right? You know, my sister's already upset that she's not going to get the best salary increase that Lieutenant Governor Patrick promised. And so look forward to kind of more guidance as we move along, and David will talk about it in his session. The teacher incentive and designations part of the program, it basically allows school districts to create a local optional teacher merit pay structure using kind of commissioner-approved designations of a master, exemplary, recognized. Now, they didn't trust the commissioner to necessarily do this on his own because of all the pushback that the teacher groups gave him, so we're going to kind of have Texas Tech oversee kind of how they do these designations. And the commissioner may not use STAR when determining kind of a teacher evaluation system. This is then linked with the teacher incentive allotment, depending on your designation. Teachers can get anywhere between $3,000 and $12,000. If you're a high-needs campus or a rural campus, there's multipliers on that could triple those amounts. This is local optional. You don't have to do it. That was kind of at the end of the day, the bargain that they made with the teacher groups. They also created a mentor program allotment. If you're going to have teachers that mentor teachers with 2 years left of experience, the commissioner is going to have some control over an allotment to give school districts. So look out for that one as you move forward. Full day pre-K. This was a big issue for Raise Your Hand Texas for the last 11 years. Along with Dallas Commit, along with Texans Care for Children. There's over 40 organizations that got behind full day pre-K. We had a big marketing campaign of Stop the Yo-Yo, right? Because of all the grant funding that has been going on and then pulled away year after year. They actually finally got it through, but not in a way that we thought was the best way, but it's there. It's a requirement for full day pre-K for eligible 4-year-olds. It is not funded through the normal formulas. And Omar is going to tell you this, as you're filling out your formulas, don't double your pre-K ADA. It's not funded as a full-time program. How it's funded is through the early education allotment. And the early education allotment is basically funded by, you get a 10% bump for your ELL and economically disadvantaged kids in grades K through 3. Now, if you already offer a full-day program, that funding can go to offset your full-day program. If you don't have a program, you might want to use it on your full-day program. If you don't have enough seats, you can waive it for 2 3-year periods. You're going to have to get a waiver from the commissioner. You're going to have to prove that you tried to do a private-public partnership with a different organization. Your board has final approval. You don't have to do that private partnership, but you have to prove that you at least sought out different seat options as you move forward. This is a big deal moving forward. We're proud that there's a full-day requirement for pre-K, but it is going to create some interesting budget issues along the way. How are you going to supplant some of this? When times get tough, are they going to cut this allotment? We would still like to see it funded through the actual formula. The economically disadvantaged students, the spectrum weight, as you heard a lot about. The comp ed weight at a 0.2% drives about $4 billion through the foundation school program. They switched that up. It's no longer based on the free and reduced lunch form. You've probably heard a lot about this. It's going to be based on census blocks, right? And so there's 5 tiers that the commissioner is going to establish after he kind of meets with this advisory committee. And depending on the high needs campus and what level they are and what percentage they are, they're going to flow a new weight from 0.225 to 0.275. That flows an additional $1.5 billion on top of the $4 billion to students who need it the most. Now, you're supposed to spend about 90% on the campus, which the weight originated. Be careful as you're budgeting for this because it still needs to go through a rulemaking process. There still needs to be an advisory committee. But it is important to know that there are some structures out there that still need to be approved. I'm getting here. School district tax rates, and Curtis touched upon this quite a bit. We're going to reduce your tax rates from $1 down to 93 cents. Second year is where it gets complicated. You're no longer going to have to calculate your rate to maintain. All of that's going to be done by the Texas Education Agency. They're going to send in their tax rates. They're going to do this fun little thing that says you can't get within about 10% of the highest district, you can't reduce your tax rate below that. And the 2.5% is going to drive district tax rates down district by district, right? And then that was the whole thing of the court case, is substantially similar revenue for substantially similar tax rates. They thought they could cut that off by putting the 10% band on there. And over time, there's going to be some pretty drastic swings, like Austin ISD is growing pretty fast, right? And West Texas districts aren't. They're going to see that 10 cent drop fairly quick because of the 2.5% cap. And so it's just something to look out for as we move forward. As we mentioned, it prohibits school districts from increasing M&O tax rates to create surplus to pay off debt service. TREs have to be on uniform election date. You have 8 golden pennies now, but it prevents TREs in 2019 unless you've already adopted a strategic plan as of January 1st, 2019. How many of you did that along the way? And so, there's a lot to deal with the tax rate structure. TASBO does a great job of this. They changed the way the golden and copper pennies work. Like I said, it no longer leaks the golden penny to the Austin yield. It's basically the 96th percentile of wealth of the 160th of the basic, 160% of the basic allotment, which is about 98.56. The golden penny would have been at about $120 per WADA. So they cut quite a bit off of that, but they gave you 2 more along the way. The copper penny, it's no longer $31.95, it's 80% of the basic allotment, but any revenue gain you see from that increase in the basic allotment is going to reduce that tax rate in that tier for you. So you don't get to see that benefit, it's just reducing your tax rate in that tier. On average, you get to see about a 1 or 2 cent reduction because of the increase in the copper penny yield. More on the 2.5%. Raise your hand, push back on this pretty hard during the session, primarily because of the long-term implications of it all, right? It's a district-by-district basis. It's a substantial, as I mentioned, upwards of $1 billion of additional state cost every year. There is a 10% threshold on that. That TEA is going to have to start calculating, as I said, in year 2. And on top of it all, the LBB is going to come back next session with a study that says we're going to study tax rate compression even more and potential revenue sources to actually reduce property taxes even farther, right? They wanted to do it even more with the sales tax swap. They just didn't have the votes to get that done. So I want to give enough time for Mike here. Efficiency audits. If you're going to go after a TRE, you're going to have to conduct an efficiency audit before voter approval. It gives you a handful of months to get this done. The LBB is going to be developing some timelines for this. This was pushed by the Texas Public Policy Foundation, basically to do, you compare yourself to different districts and staffing ratios and other things that you're going to have to post on your website. And this might become an issue for school districts that want to pass a TRE. The gifted and talented allotment became a fairly big issue along the way. There was a lot of pushback from parents, a lot of kids testifying. They wanted to basically repeal the allotment. You guys were maxing out anyway, pump that $120 million back into the basic allotment. But because there was so much pushback, this is now going to be one of the most audited programs that you have, right? You're going to have to annually certify that you have a gifted and talented program. If you fail to kind of certify that, the commissioner can come back and take some money away from you. And you're going to have to adopt policies that basically say, how are you using funds to provide for the gifted and talented program? Other funding changes, and it's all kind of in this document as well. They provide half-day funding for an extended year program up to 30 days. They created dyslexia and dual language weight. They increased the mainstream special education weight. They dropped CTE funding down to the 7th and 8th grade. They provide $50 per student for P-TECH and New Tech. There's another supplemental funding program for students with dyslexia. They increased the NIFA, the new instructional facilities allotment for new campuses, to $100 million. Remember last session they increased the actual amount per student from $250 to $1,000. That was basically prorated down because they only had $26 million available. They increased to $100 million. So if you're opening a new campus, expect that $1,000 per student. If you are one of the fastest growing school districts over the last 3 years, the top quartile, they did create a fast growth school allotment. On average, I think it's about $250, $300 per student to be determined. And so that money is out there if you are a fairly fast growing school district. And it creates a dropout recovery school allotment along the way too. School board goals, real quick. Every year you're going to have to develop and post online 5-year childhood literacy plans, math proficiency plans, and CCMR plans. You're going to have quantifiable goals. You kind of already do this in your long and short-term plans, but it's going to have to be more visible due to House Bill 3. Same with K-3 reading standards. This was kind of the flip. Instead of no outcomes-based funding for 3rd grade, basically said we're going to have to offer more phonics curriculum. We're going to have to send our elementary school teachers in K through 3 to a literacy achievement academy along with their principal. TEA has revamped the reading academies. My guess is they'll flow all that professional development through those academies, but it is yet to be seen how this is going to work. And there's going to be an advisory committee to help set this up. Blended learning, and because I put the slide on there, it's basically for a $5 million grant for blended learning. It's a program that kind of merges technology with curriculum, and it's Raise Your Hand's been involved in this space for the last 3 years. It's a good program. We just opened it up, Raising Blending Learners 2. If you feel like you need to fill out an application, let me know. One things we pushed back hard on was the 3rd grade outcomes-based funding that basically said if you're a 3rd grader and you pass the STAR and you're economically disadvantaged, you get $5,000 for doing that. If you're non-economically disadvantaged, you would get $3,000. We didn't think that was the best way to do it. We thought that, hey, a 3rd grader funding shouldn't be based on an 8-year-old on one given day for a test. They pulled that out of House Bill 3, but what ended up was the college career and military readiness bonus. So the commissioner is going to set some thresholds for SAT, ACT, the TSI, and the Armed Services exam. If you enroll in any of those, if you enroll in colleges or a certificate, and you cross that threshold, the school district will get anywhere between $2,000 and $5,000 depending on the type of student. School safety, big issue, $100 million came from the rainy day fund. On average, it's going to be about $10 per student. You can fund secure facilities, provide security, school safety training and planning. You're going to have to develop kind of long-term plans for trauma-informed practices. The commissioner is going to set some new rules for you. And the Texas School Safety Center is going to have to do a handful of audits every year of school districts and report back to TEA. TRS, they spent a lot of money on TRS, right, at $1.1 billion, mostly for the 13th check, mostly through the state contribution. But be aware, while the state contribution begins in 2020, school districts increases start in 2021 and go up by about 0.1% on average per year. Active employees begin their contribution increase in 2022. Right when the pay raise kind of flatlines, they're going to see a bump in their TRS active contribution. So just be aware of that moving forward. And I know assessment isn't part of the finance plan, but I thought you need to know what's going on in the assessment, because that was the other big conversation that snuck below the radar, right? They are not for testing over there, but Commissioner Morath wants to kind of revamp how STAR is done. So they want to administer STAR in smaller parts, up to 2 to 3 days. No longer than 60 or 75 minutes. No testing on Mondays. They want to move to online testing by 2023. They want to create more of a formative test instead of what the STAR is, so that teachers can actually use that test and kind of guide instruction. There's going to be some technical advisory committees. And the whole reading assessment battle ended up basically, you can't have more than 75% of your tests as multiple choice. That means 25% of it's going to be embedded writing questions, short-term, long-term, long-form essays. And they want to eliminate the 4th and 7th grade writing exam by 2021. Other assessment issues, they're going to have some civics questions on the end of course history exam. We're going to have to report back if our kids know our civics fairly well. And they extended the IGC committees for another 4 years.
Good morning, everybody. I'll make this brief and we'll stay on time. It's good to be at Region 10 and see this new center. Gordon, great job. Appreciate your work. Appreciate the Service Center. I think everybody here knows that the Service Center is still a great place for information like this and training like this. Curtis said, I said, what's my role in this? He said, just use the slide that says any questions. But a perspective, I guess, on the path forward. And my perspective after watching this, having worked in Austin, like many of the speakers you will hear today, and having spent a little time working with elected officials, this is a pretty profound time, pretty profound piece of legislation. We've probably had the last 50 years, we've probably had 4 or 5 major pieces of legislation that have come along that have had to be enacted. After the Gilmer-Aiken laws, of course, we had the Parole Commission, and we then had Senate Bill 1 by Senator Ratliff and Paul Sadler. We had House Bill 5 by Jimmy Don Aycock, and then we've had this legislation. And everybody I know gets concerned about it and gets worried about what's going to happen. And this is my prediction. In August, we're going to have about 5.4 million kids that are going to show up for school, and we're going to teach them, and we're going to have school. And we're going to work with this system. My suggestion is be appreciative. Be appreciative for what's happened, and yet at the same time be factual without whining, and keep your communities informed about what is happening and how this legislation is being implemented. Ross Ramsey wrote a piece a week or 2 ago in the Texas Tribune, something like, do what I say, don't do what I do. You've been limited on how much you can raise taxes. How much did Curtis's slides say the state budget's going up? 15.8%, is that right? So he's right when he talks about a little suppression. It's not a little suppression, it's probably a lot of suppression. I think there are other things to be grateful about. Bob mentioned one of them, no outcomes-based funding. No legislation, we didn't hear anything about legislation about parent triggers this year, did we? Did anybody hear anything mentioned about school vouchers this session? Did we get a bill filed on that? Maybe even introduced? Didn't go very far if it did. There were some good things. David Thompson does a beautiful job talking about election results and what happens and the messages that the people of Texas send to elected officials. But this was basically a session that was pro-public education. Now, some of the things that got enacted, we'll probably have to work to tweak and may have to work in the next 2 to 6 years to undo some of it. But we know how to do that. You know how to do that. You've done it before, and we'll do that, and we'll make the course corrections that are needed for boys and girls. I actually think things are spinning in your favor and in favor of schools in Texas. Speaker Dennis Bonham, last week of the session, made a statement. And he said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to campaign for incumbent members of the legislature. And anybody that wants to oppose incumbents is opposing me. And if they do that, they do it at their own peril. Well, there's a message there. The message is to some of the fringe groups, I call them fringe groups, they probably wouldn't like that term, Empower Texas, Texas Public Policy Foundation, others who have been highly critical of public schools. The message to them is, I'm not going to spend my time trying to please you guys. I'm not going to spend my time trying to figure out what y'all want because I can't do it. Nobody can do it. He basically was laying down his marker. Well, I don't know if you've seen the news this morning, but Governor Abbott came out and said he's not going to campaign against any incumbent members of his own party. He campaigned last time against Lyle Larson from San Antonio and Sarah Davis from Houston. He actually campaigned against incumbent members. There are some messages there, and I think perhaps even David will elaborate on that a little further, but the messages are, I think things are spinning in favor of schools. What happened this session? Was it perfect? No, it never is. But here's the thing. Do we ever get finished? Are we ever finished with school finance? Are we ever finished with school funding? No, we're not. Last thing I'll share with you is the story about don't ask the questions if you don't know the answers. In a trial, a southern small-town prosecuting attorney called his first witness, a grandmotherly, elderly woman, to the stand. He approached her and asked, Miss Jones, you know me? She replied, well, yes, I know you, Mr. Williams. I've known you since you were a boy, and frankly, you've been a big disappointment to me. You lie, you cheat on your wife, you manipulate people, you talk about them behind their backs. You don't have the sense to know or to realize you're not going to amount to anything more than a paper pusher. A 2-bit paper pusher at that. Yes, I know you. The lawyer was stunned, not knowing what else to do. He pointed across the room and said, Miss Jones, do you know the defense attorney? She again replied, well, yes, I do. I've known Mr. Bradley since he was a youngster. He's lazy and he has a drinking problem. He can't build a normal relationship with anyone. His law practice is one of the worst in the entire state. Not to mention that he cheated on his wife with 3 different women. One of them was your wife. Yes, I know him. The defense attorney nearly died. The judge asked both counselors to approach the bench and in a very quiet voice said, if either one of you guys ask her if she knows me, I'm going to send both of you to the electric chair. Sometimes we don't want to know. We don't need to know. The truth of it is, I have a lot of confidence in what's going to happen going forward. I think things are moving in your direction. I think you have to continue to tell the school story. You have to know who your friends are, be factual, and you'll be ready to uplift your teachers, your principals, and everyone when they come to work, and we'll be ready to do a great job for the school kids in Texas. Thank you very much.